Welcome to the debate. Today, we're exploring what is really one of the most profound conflicts in 20th century thought, the clash between revolutionary collectivism and liberal individualism. We're looking at the deep incompatibility between the call for radical change in Marx and Engels' The Manifesto and the stark warning in F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom.
And this goes so far beyond just politics, doesn't it? It's a fundamental dispute over the very nature of society, of power, and what human freedom really means. And it's a dispute that, I think, still shapes almost everything today.
It absolutely does. So the central question, the thing we have to wrestle with, is this. Does the total centralization of an economy, which is framed as this revolutionary step towards equality, does that inevitably destroy individual liberty and, well, the rule of law? My position is that this centralization is the one and only path to true collective liberation.
And I'll be arguing that any move toward that kind of central planning, no matter how idealistic the goal, fundamentally paves the road to tyranny by replacing law with arbitrary power.
Okay, then let's start with why this radical change is, from my perspective, necessary. The manifesto argues that the history of industrial society is, at its core, a history of merciless class exploitation. The existing relations of property, the whole bourgeois economic setup, have become just, completely unstable. They are, in the text's words, too narrow to contain the wealth generated by them. This leads to these constant commercial crises, this epidemic of overproduction, that just throws society into chaos. The system can't survive its own success.
The system has its flaws, I grant you, but the cure you're describing sounds far worse than the disease.
Well, the remedy requires the proletariat, the vast majority, to seize political dominance and to centralize, and I'm quoting here, all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as a ruling class. Now, this means what the authors themselves call despotic interventions in property rights. This isn't a small thing. We're talking heavy progressive taxes, abolishing inheritance, centralizing all credit and transport. These are seen as unavoidable steps to revolutionize production and ultimately to reach that final goal. An association where, quote, the free development of each one is the condition for the free development of all.
And that is a powerful, I'll admit, a powerful utopian vision. But Hayek warns us that this exact pursuit of centralized economic planning, what he calls collectivism, is precisely the road to servitude. He sees this whole movement as a complete deviation from the individualist path of Western civilization, which, valued the limited state and the protection of the individual above all else.
But he completely ignores the pre-existing subjugation that makes individual liberty a hollow phrase for most people.
He focuses on the mechanics of control. For Hayek, the core problem is that central planning just can't limit itself to general, formal laws. The rule of law works because it's abstract. It applies to everyone equally. A planning authority, on the other hand, has to make specific, concrete decisions about which needs are prioritized. This forces it to make, as he puts it, distinctions of merit among the needs of different people. And that process, that shift, replaces the impersonal market with arbitrary administrative coercion. And that is the foundation of totalitarianism, which Hayek argues is the inevitable outcome of collectivism.
Okay, let's talk about that word arbitrariness, because this is really where the two philosophies collide head-on. I understand why you see a threat in administrative power, but let me offer another way to look at it. What Hayek calls arbitrary power is simply the visible result of destroying the old, hidden arbitrariness of class exploitation.
That's a strong ideological framing, but I want to stick to the institutional reality of what it takes to govern.
But the institutional reality is that the existing system, the bourgeois one, subjects the worker who has, and this is key, nothing of their own to secure. The whole point of despotic intervention is to destroy the private securities and private assurances that only the minority possess. The arbitrariness you fear is just the transfer of decision-making from the anonymous tyranny of the market to the conscious and temporary direction of the majority.
But if we look at Hayek's actual analysis of the planning mechanism, we see why this shift is so dangerous no matter who's in charge. He says very clearly that when the state manages everything, the authority must provide for the real needs of the people as they arise. You simply cannot write a formal law for that. If two people need the same steel shipment, an administrator has to use their discretion, their judgment to decide who is more important. This leads directly to what he calls a despotism exercised by a conscientious and honest bureaucracy. The intentions might be good, but the power is by its very nature arbitrary.
But again, this obsession with formal bourgeois law ignores the hypocrisy of bourgeois freedom and equality. Those are just fancy words for free competition, freedom for capital owners, not for laborers. We are replacing the arbitrary structural violence of the market, which makes choice meaningless for most, with a conscious temporary direction needed to get to universal freedom. The severity of the surgery is dictated by the severity of the disease.
You're focused entirely on the end goal, but you have to account for the means. And that brings us to the link between economic control and all other freedoms. Honestly, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it pretends economic activity is separate from the rest of life. Hayek's whole point is that control over the economy is control over the means that will serve all our ends.
But what good is control over means when the individual is already subjugated? The worker has no property. Their laws, their religion, their morals, these are all, as the manifesto says, bourgeois prejudices forced on them. So how can you base an argument for freedom on protecting property rights for a class that owns nothing? Our path creates freedom precisely by enabling the free development of each one, and that can only happen through collective control.
I see it from the complete opposite direction. Hayek argues that whoever controls the economy will determine what men should believe, because if you control the means, you ultimately control the ends people are allowed to pursue. Think about it. An engineer in a planned society versus, say, a low-paid, unskilled worker in a competitive one. The engineer is valued, yes, but he's fundamentally trapped by the plan. He can't just decide to become a poet if the plan says he needs to build a bridge somewhere.
And what choice does the laborer in the competitive system truly have? To work in this factory or starve? That is hardly freedom.
But Hayek argues that the poorly paid laborer has one fundamental freedom that the state engineer lacks: the freedom to choose his own path, to change jobs, to move, without asking permission from a central authority. Economic freedom, the choice in how to use what little you have, is the necessary condition for all other freedoms. It's what protects a pluralism of goals in society. Once you put all the economic means under one political authority, you eliminate any institutional guarantee for other ways of life.
The pluralism you're defending only offers choices to those who can afford them. It's an illusion for the poor. Our objective, the classless society, transcends that.
But the mechanism you propose, total planning, requires a single purpose. It has to be enforced. Which brings us to your ultimate claim, the end goal.
Exactly. The manifesto is explicit that this centralized power is temporary. Once class differences vanish, it says the public power loses its political character. And why? Because political power is defined only as the organized power of one class for oppressing another. So the coercive measures, these despotic interventions, they're just transitional tools. You eliminate the class antagonism, and the state, by historical necessity, withers away.
That is a very compelling argument for the ideal, but have you considered the psychological and institutional changes that Hayek describes, the ones that make the withering away of the state basically impossible? His analysis suggests that the logic of total planning itself creates a permanent machine for enforcing a single purpose, usually through propaganda and suppressing truth.
But why would it need to be permanent if the class basis for its existence is gone?
Because the apparatus is required not just for oppression, but for efficiency. Central planning is incredibly complex. Hayek points out that to get anything done, the authority must be freed from the shackles represented by democratic rules. When democratic bodies inevitably fail to agree on every single economic detail, because human desires are diverse, power has to be handed over to experts who can act decisively. You're assuming the failure of democratic will. I'm assuming the impossibility of coordinating millions of individual needs without force. The institutional logic, the massive bureaucracy, the need for ideological conformity, the constant rule changes, it all creates a permanent, monolithic structure where power is concentrated. The mechanism itself, its internal logic, makes totalitarianism an inevitable outcome, regardless of the planner's good intentions. The state can't wither away if its job is to manage the totality of life.
So you fear the means will corrupt the ends, even if the ends and end to exploitation are superior.
I fear the means become the reality.
The structures you need for centralization, the bureaucracy, the ideological control, they are inherently anti-liberal. You're building a machine designed for total power and just, well, hoping that one day it will turn itself off.
Ultimately, I think this debate shows that the promise of liberty in a capitalist system, held up by formal laws, is fundamentally hollow for the majority who own nothing. The Marxist path, yes, it requires radical, despotic intervention, but it targets the root of exploitation to achieve a higher form of human association, where collective organization facilitates real, universal freedom. The risk of temporary coercion is the price for permanent liberation.
And Hayek forces us to confront the fact that the methods you use matter more than your stated ends. His analysis suggests that the concentration of power needed for economic planning, even when pursued for justice, will inevitably corrode the very mechanisms of law, tolerance, and self-determination that prevent the slide into a new and perhaps worse form of servitude. You cannot pave the road to freedom by abandoning the guardrails of limited power.
The material really forces us to weigh the risks of revolutionary change against the injustices of an unstable market.
Exactly. And it forces us to define what genuine liberty really is. Is it formal non-coercion that allows for massive inequality? Or is it liberation from class constraints, even if that means submitting, for a time, to a centralized authority? Both of these texts provide profoundly different, yet rigorous, answers to that question.